Senator Avard.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Good morning, Senator.
Good morning, Senators. Actually, submitting this bill on behalf of a constituent, and there'll be many people that testify on this bill and could answer most of your questions, so I'm here to introduce it. This bill is for the record, I'm Senator Kevin Avard, District 12, so you get used to that. This bill eliminates the Land Use Board, establishes an advisory board, and requires approval of federal land acquisitions by the governor, the executive council, and the general court. There's a number of people here to testify on behalf of this bill, but I don't know if you have any questions at this time, if you've had a chance to look at it, or, yes, sir.
Okay, Senator Reagan.
I'm just curious of what your motivation was to become the prime sponsor of this. What was the selling point that caused you to?
I think there are a number of people that their lands are in question of being acquired, and this is basically a property rights issue. And in District 12, there, of course, many of you are familiar with the pipeline in itself, and the people are up in arms about their lands being taken by eminent domain, and this is just another case of federal government taking either property. And we're just seeing a trend here. You know, this isn't pipeline related, but it is another land grab by the feds, and the people are up in arms because their properties are potentially going to be taken. So that it's a private property issue.
Okay, thank you. Are there any further questions from the committee? Seeing none. Thank you very much,
Thank you,
Senator.
Senator.
Before you go, Senator, there's a number of people here. Is there, who've signed up to speak, is there one person that you think should go first who can really explain what this is?
I think the Honorable Ann Cartwright would be very, very well spoken. She knows this inside and out, and she's looking at the legislature before.
Sounds like a plan. Ms. Cartwright, would you come forward and please identify yourself for the record?
Thank you, Senator. My name is Ann Cartwright. I'm a rep from the Cheshire County area. This legislation was put in order to bring attention to and to try and solve the problems of the existing RSA 121. I'd like to go through a few parts of that. Do you have a copy of it, or would you like a paper copy?
If you have copies, could you please hand them to our committee aide? Thank you.
Wait, that's the wrong one. These two, and I can't find my other one. It's in here, but I can't find it at the moment. They'll come across it. Back in 1935, when RSA 121 was put into law, there were a number of stipulations for the purpose of the federal government acquiring property for the purpose of public conservation, forestry, recreation, experimentation, and demonstration. And in each section, there are different parts. One of the important parts is 121:3. No land shall be acquired pursuant to this chapter until the acquisition shall have been recommended by the Land Use Board. Now, unhappily, it has never happened. This law has never been followed. That's the first part of it. It's never been followed. The Planning and Economic Development Committee was repealed and put into dread. And so it seems to have gotten lost, and the Land Use Board was abolished. And so the way of following this has never really been implemented, even though it's been on the books since 1935. The second part of it, another part, is 121:4. The Land Use Board was supposed to take action for any acquisition by the federal by notifying the town or city 14 days before, and the selectman or the mayor or the alderman could then request that there be a town meeting, like a public hearing in such town or city, so that they could vote on whether they wanted that to happen. So it gave the towns the ability to say, no, this isn't for the good of our town, and therefore we don't want it. Never been followed. Then 120, we go to 121.6. Lands which may be acquired under this chapter is such that the reason of quality, location, condition, or public, better adapted to public conservation, forestry, recreation, experimental, and demonstration purposes, than for the continued private ownership and development way that it is. So therefore, that was supposed to be part of what the land use board justified why this land was better suited for those purposes. Never been done. Also within this, the state limited the total percentage of land area that could be acquired to 2%, not excluding the White Mountain National Forest as set forth by the boundaries of October 26, 1929. So it limited it to 2%, but also within this, it limited the evaluation, the town or city to the amount of land, the assessed valuation of which as of April 1st of the preceding year was 5% of the total assessed valuation on such date of all real estate in such town or city. So there was a 5% of the tax base rule, basically, for this. That was never followed. Then we go to 121.7. There is the Umbagog National Wildlife Refuge up in northern New Hampshire has been dealing with this for many more years. And I do have a letter someplace here, where Mike Lewitt requested the jurisdiction of the state police, and they stated that Maine had concurrent jurisdiction, but New Hampshire only had proprietary. However, in RSA 121:7, the state shall retain concurrent jurisdiction with the United States in and over all lands acquired hereunto so far that the civil and criminal law of this state shall apply on said lands, and exclusive jurisdiction in and said two lands shall revert to the state when such lands shall cease to be owned by the United States. So this, and that, now the final one is 121.8, that no owner of land which the United States proposes hereby to acquire shall be required to sell by institution of proceedings of condemnation. So, and this bill has never been followed. A similar bill was heard in this House, and Dred was asked to come up with the numbers. I have a copy of, some copies of that, if you'd like.
Yes, please.
Okay. There's 3 there, I think. Now, I have no problems with what this contains. However, it doesn't, what it doesn't contain, the information from Dred, is very concerning, because it does not contain the dates of the acquisition, the towns in which the acquisitions were made, and it doesn't have, therefore, the information on the 5% rule. It doesn't have the information on the, if any town meetings were held and the people approved such purchases. So I enter that information. Now, the concerns, a number of concerns are, as far as the acquisition, as you know, the federal government does not pay property taxes. So the more land in a town that's taken out for of the taxation on fewer and fewer residents who end up being taxed out of their property. It's a huge problem. Here, as far as what the Silvio Conte and others, Wildlife Refuge, they do not, this one, they do not, I don't know if that's the right one, but at any rate, they do not pay the taxes, but they have, and Robert Lord is here from the Underdog, and he can testify as to the amount of money they have given the town in lieu of taxes, and the percentages have gone down dramatically. So there's that aspect of it. The other problem is that when they had the hearings on this, because I should have said this, my husband and my property, we own a tree farm in Alstead, New Hampshire, is part of their present focus area for acquisition. In fact, the towns around us, there are a number of percentages. The town of Gilsum, 52% of the town is in their focus area. And it is not a rich community. So the damage to their tax base will be horrific. Alstead is 37, if I remember. The selectmen wrote a letter to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife opposing the acquisition. I am also going to be presenting at our deliberative session a resolution to go on the ballot concerning the townspeople, whether they would favor such a thing. Also, the town, even before the comment period had ended on the Silvio Conte expansion, to include, I also would like to point out the maps at the back that are up there. The map on the door to the left, if you could move a bit so they can see, is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife map of the watershed of the Connecticut River from Canada to the ocean, for which they are planning the expansion of the Silvio Conte Wildlife Refuge. It's massive. You take that and you add to the right where it's green up in the north, that's the Umbedon that they're taking. Then you go down a little bit and you have the White Mountain National Forest. Now, talk about bold, now they have just proposed it's a brand new proposal that came out in January by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to start a new wildlife refuge called the Great Thicket National Wildlife Refuge that will include the coast of New Hampshire, and curving across in the Merrimack Valley and joining up with the watershed of the Connecticut River. It's called the Great American Thicket. That just came out, and we just found out about it. I said, oh my word. That, surprisingly, also includes the entire state of Massachusetts, Rhode Island, most of Connecticut, into New York, to the Hudson River, and up and back again, and then goes across the border in New Hampshire until we get out of the Connecticut River, and then it goes up so that it includes more of New Hampshire. It's a massive, massive proposal that is going to take years, but it's also going to totally take most of the state of New Hampshire as it is proposed right now. So I don't think that I think that the people do, and the state does a better job of conservation for wildlife. But I think this tells us we had better be concerned about the conservation of ability of the people of New Hampshire to have a place to live, work, and grow their own food. Now, the other thing that's important to know, that the second map, big map that's on the bulletin board, is called the Quabbin to Cardigan Partnership. Now, in that, if you see the co-sponsors, U.S. Fish and Wildlife is one of the partners, because most of that includes part of the Connecticut River watershed that they want. And all of these NGOs and other organizations are helping to acquire it through easements. And to point out the connection, April 17, 2015, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, with the help of the National Wildlife Refuge Association, recently established the Muskoma River Division of the Silvio Conte National Fish and Wildlife Refuge in Canaan, New Hampshire. The 762-acre conservation easement was acquired through the combination of funds from the Land and Water Conservation Fund and a donation from a landowner, Bear Hill Conservancy Trust. So it wasn't private, it was done through these conservation groups. The Land and Water Conservation Fund is funded by the federal government. So, now the town of Canaan sent a letter, because of course this happened before they even had the comment period from the people, and I was at the comment periods, and I told them, no, I don't pick, you only had a choice of A, B, C, or D, how much land they were going to take. I told them, none of the above. It is time the state steps up, finds a way to get this law on the books implemented, and hold kick the federal government out of being able to take over time, all of this land mass. Let's see, I think I've covered, in case you want this. Also, this map here, I'll send this up to you with a smaller version of what I have printed up there.
Yeah, just set it on the corner, I'll have to get it in a second.
If I can, you've got a lot of papers there and you keep referring to them. If you could just put them in a pile at the corner of the desk, our aide will go and make copies for everyone. That
Okay.
way you can just finish up your testimony and
Okay.
we'll take the time to look at it.
Now, I do have some concerns because we don't know the breakdown in the DRED report concerning how the Silvio Conte draft states that already in New Hampshire, it has Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire. It lists preserved lands by state and by federal, state, local, private, and unknown. It lists here that the state of New Hampshire already has in the Connecticut River watershed 238,173 acres. Now, in DRED's own report, it talks about the 2% being 114,000, I'm sorry, I can't find it at the moment in the paper here, but it's 114,000 or something. That's the 2% mark. Now, we don't know how much of that they are talking about, because the White Mountain National Forest, a small portion of it is part of the Connecticut River watershed, I believe. But we don't have that information totally. This shows the Umbagog. I don't have a big map of the Umbagog, but that shows this is the state boundary. A lot of it's Maine, but this is New Hampshire portion, which connects with the Connecticut River watershed. Now, my husband and I, back in 2009, went to a meeting at the Grapponi Center concerning when Vilsack, Secretary of Agriculture Vilsack, was going on a tour around the country concerning the America's Great Outdoors. And at that event, of course, mainly NGOs who make their living in this business were there, but there were a few of us landowners. Now, their goal was to preserve So that, this seems to be accomplishing that goal. Let's see, if there's anything. I think that they are saying that they do not take the land by eminent domain, that they buy from willing sellers. However, it doesn't really matter, because if the willing sellers sell, then the town is severely impacted, the state is severely impacted, and RSA 121 really does not allow that. So I do not agree that an individual landowner can be offered, and Bob Lord can testify to this, to get them to sell part of the state of New Hampshire to the federal government.
Okay, thank you very much for your testimony this morning. Are there any questions? Seeing none, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
At this point, I'm going to announce we've had a lot of testimony already. There are a number of folks that want to come up to speak. So what I'm going to ask you is, if you have something prepared, don't read it. Just try to paraphrase it as best you can, and then just pass it in. We're not executing this bill today, so we'll have time to read it. Don't repeat testimony that we've already had. Just please offer us new testimony. And again, we'll take it from there. We're going to go ahead and call Reverend Garrett Lear.
We'll have no other king but King Jesus. Now, I know some people might think that that is just a statement of my faith in Christ as my Savior, but it's also a statement about what America is about. And what we have going on in America today is a return to the divine right kings that we fought against in 1776. We read in Scripture in 1 Samuel chapter 8 that God did not want us to have a king. It was not his idea. And of course, I'm coming before you as our elected senators, and I'm asking you to please protect us. And I have to say that I grew up, I have dual citizenship, born in Massachusetts and also raised in New Hampshire. I live beside the salt marsh in Northampton along our beautiful seacoast. I've had the experience with EPA and federal agencies and so forth and so on. I also want to remind you that in your, and this is something that for 26 years ago, and I moved back home from out west, after being away, to remind us of what the 10th Amendment is. The power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution or prohibited to it by the states, or reserved to the states respectively or to the people. And please understand, I'm not wearing my hat to be disrespectful as a gentleman, just to prove a point here of we the people. And the issue of the 10th Amendment is very important and gives authorization to the state of New Hampshire to protect us. Or in our own Constitution, in New Hampshire, Article 5, power to make laws, elect officers, define their powers and duties, impose fines, it says taxes prohibited from authorizing towns to aid certain corporations. If we went out to the front door of the Capitol building on Main Street, right above the door says Republic of New Hampshire. What does that mean? If I said that we were the United States of America, or how about the States of America United? If we said it that way, understanding that the federal government is only supposed to own a small portion of land called Washington, D.C. And aside from that, forts, docks, things of necessary import, arsenals and whatever else. And now we have the Bureau of Land Management coming over and wants to take over land. And the issue is Representative Cartwright had brought out about the eminent domain. That is a total abuse of eminent domain, and what they're doing is, of course, yeah, people are selling out because if they don't sell out, they're going to be forced out. And they have to go through court cases they can't afford, and they're being paid dimes on the dollar. That's what we're having. That's an imperial federal government, and I'm asking you in this legislature, in this Senate, to stand against that for New Hampshire and do actually what our country was started to do, in the states having certain powers that have been bestowed to them by the sovereignty of the people. So I thank you for giving me the opportunity to testify, and I do want to remind you also, I know that the feds many times come in with promises of money, but I'll remind you of what Benjamin Franklin said. He said, with shekels comes shackles, and that's what we're facing here.
next speaker's gonna be Bob Lord, is that what it is? Bob, how do you say your last name, Lord?
Lord,
Thank you. Welcome, Bob.
Well, thank you for letting us speak. I think I'm probably the only one who lives within a refuge in this place right now.
Can you identify yourself?
My name is Robert Lord from Merrill. The federal government currently owns 14,000 acres of Merrill's 37,000 acres. In lieu of taxes, they pay roughly right around 21% of what they're supposed to pay. The taxes are just a small issue for us. Our town depends on timber tax revenue. In 2005, we paid a county tax of $205,000. This year it's $400,000 because there is no timber cut. They have a 15-year plan on the Avard Wildlife Refuge that entails 950 cords per year over the next 15 years. That's 2 days working with a shear. Guy goes in, he can drop, a good man on a shear can take out 30,000 cord of wood. And the whole their forestry program is a joke. They're the worst land managers you could ever imagine. They cut out an entire deer yard for a woodcock singing area. I do survey work. I used to do survey work for Fish and Game on woodcock singing in the spring. They cut out an entire deer yard because there was some aspen in there. Well, they since changed their tune on that because the fall and spring, of course, the deer go back to a winter yard because they're accustomed to it. 23 dead deer were laying there next spring. If you go on any of the dirt roads in the refuge, you're going to get stopped by a warden. He'll immediately put on his lights, the federal warden, and he'll question you why you've been there. One guy up there this past fall was running a bear with dogs. The bear crossed the corner of the refuge, went up on the private land that he had permission to go, and the bear treed. He wasn't killing the bear, it was just training his dogs. The warden stopped him on the main road, said, "What are you doing?" He told him, he says, "I want to see your license." He held his license for a half hour, would not give it back to him. He said, "Can I have my license back?" He said, "You'll get it back when I feel like it." This is a true story, this actually happened. And finally the guy said, "Keep the license. I don't care." He went in, got his dogs, the warden wanted to go in to see the bear. He says, "No, you're on private land, you stay out of here, you're a federal work, you don't need to be up there." And when he came back out on the road, the warden finally gave his license back. Just plain 100% harassment. But they're killing us up there. They're absolutely killing us by degrees. And as far as the total acreage of the Avard Wildlife Refuge, we have a map. It's going to be right around 267,000 acres when they're done with it. The total watershed of the Connecticut River, by the way, is about 1.9 million acres. Okay, they want all of it. They're doing this in northern Maine too. Now, I'm a part-time resident of Newfoundland, Canada. My property is above the national park, Rosemont National Park. I'm surrounded by provincial land. That's provincial land. That's the people's land. For $20, I can get a permit, I can cut 8 cord firewood, I can cut 10,000 board feet of lumber a year. That's because it's the people's land. What's happening in Errol is not the people's land. It belongs to the elite. We have tried to get people up there. We're overjoyed that we're having these meetings because we cannot get Shaheen up there, we cannot get Senator Ayon up there. Nobody will come and talk to us in the town of Errol. We're only 200 people. There's not enough votes. And now, I maintain for the last 7 years that when this hits the right people, and you haven't seen anything yet, because when it starts to, wait till they hit Cape Cod, because the Great Thicket once part of Cape Cod. And when that hits, you're going to see an uproar. The only weapon that we have, and we've been talking about it up there, is that you do not snowmobile around Errol, Pittsburgh, Colbert, Columbia When you're snowmobiling up there, you're going on private land. When you ATV, it is all private land. And the only weapon that we have to get the people's attention in the state of New Hampshire is to say, no more. I own 62 acres of land, I got a snow machine trail going through it. No more. Because the lifeblood of our community is logging. Tourism is nothing. It's a minimum wage job. 30 hours max because they don't have to pay health care. That's what it is up there. You take the typical logger in our town. I left the house this morning at 5 o'clock. I got up at 4 o'clock. The loggers were already gone. The average logger gets up at 2:30 in the morning. He goes to work because of the federal land, they have to go 25 miles into the woods to cut. He's home at 7 o'clock at night. He immediately goes to bed. That's 5 days a week. I mean, the hours are incredible to make a living for these guys. And what's gonna happen is that as the feds own more and more land, they're gonna take that away. And you're gonna see the North Country die.
Thank you.
Yeah. I've got a letter here from my wife.
No, I'm not gonna read the letter.
Okay, I'm not gonna read it, but it's on those figures. My wife is a financial administrator for the area.
We'll take care of that.
She's got all those figures.
I'll take that.
Mr. Guyer.
Good, how you doing? I have enough copies for all. Honorable Senators and members of the committee, I have two pieces. Okay, my name is Robert Guyda. I am the town moderator for the town of Warren, representing the Board of Selectmen, also representing myself as a citizen impacted by the potential of this legislation. I speak in opposition to the amendment, not because dramatic changes are not necessary, but because I think it is more in the execution rather than in the structure that the repairs to RSA 121 need to be made. The town of Warren is 52% White Mountain National Forest. Every year, more land is taken. And if you read RSA 121, those communities within the prospective boundaries of the National Forest are denied the due process rights stipulated in 121. We've been unable to find why that is, but our town continues to get eaten by the National Forest. And it's no malice on their part, they're just doing what they do. We have no means other than supplication. Please don't take our land. I've done that as a selectman, they respected that. They're taking more land now. We're a town of about 850 people. Whenever we lose a piece of property off the tax rolls, it significantly impacts us because the rest of us have to bear that burden. The bill payments that we receive are significantly below what should be paid for the value of the land and the timber on it. And so my request of you, as you'll read in my letter, is to consider amending RSA 121:6 to remove the prohibition on people in communities within the prospective boundaries of the National Forest to due process that's afforded every other town and community in the state. We believe we should have the right to say no, because we don't have that right at present. We can ask, but there's no need to respond even, much less to comply with our requests. That's the first part of my testimony. And you'll find a couple of resolutions from our planning board and our board of selectmen. Those are the only weapons that we have. We can ask, please don't do this to us. As we speak, 550 of the best acres in my town are about to be deeded over to the White Mountain National Forest through donation. We have no recourse. We keep getting eaten alive, our tax base keeps going down, our taxes keep going up. This is a problem that is endemic to all the communities within the prospective boundaries. I would like to read, I know it's a short letter, but I'm here as well after a significant discussion with the chairman of RR&D, Chris Christensen, over in the House. I spent several hours on the phone with him and have his explicit permission to present to the committee repairs to 121 and to the process that he believes, as a chairman, should be done and quickly. And I'll just go to those, there are the 5 items numbered on this letter. First is a mechanism to alert DRED and others that the Fish and Wildlife Service is intending to acquire a specific property. As the law is written right now, the statistical computation of the 2% of land area or the 5% evaluation is after the transaction has already taken place. And trying to undo it after it has exceeded the limit is much more expensive than having DRED given the information so that they can determine that those limits are complied with before the transaction proceeds. Second is a mechanism to ensure that the Fish and Wildlife Service follows 121 to have their land acquisition approved by the Government Council. DRED has indicated they will be speaking to the Attorney General about this. No timeline yet. That's pretty significant. The Fish and Wildlife Service, I will tell you, in my town, are feared and despised. They are tyrants. They think they own the people's land in the state's land, and they act that way. I have met these fellow that retired. He was told he better retire because he may not survive his continued behavior. His name is Herb Carstens, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. These people have no respect for the citizens of the communities, or the land, or any potential land rights that go along with the ownership of those of our national forests. Third is an evaluation from DRED that a proposed acquisition meets the 2 and 5% guidelines in RSA 121. Pretty self-explanatory. Number 4, a mechanism financially to ensure or mitigate the loss of tax base to town. New Hampshire Municipal has not weighed in on this, but they may have suggestions. The federal government does have payments in lieu of taxes, but they are pittance compared to the valuation. We get about $24,000 a year for 52% of the land mass of our town. That is, and we have no recourse to seek any kind of remedy because they just keep taking and we just have to take what's given to us. Number 5, from the chairman of RR&D in the House, while there might be some sort of upfront tax mitigation that should not relieve the Fish and Wildlife Service or other federal agencies from ongoing tilt or payments in lieu of timber tax. And so, you as a committee have the authority to introduce amendments. These are the things that the House chairman of the committee on addressing this issue believes need to be addressed. I would ask as well that you consider the amendment that I have proposed to simply strike the language that excludes the people of the towns within the prospective boundaries from having any due process rights to protect the land that comprises our towns.
Okay. Thank you very much for your testimony, Representative. Honorable Robert Bennett, it's good to see you again. Are there any questions from the committee? Senator Cataldo.
That's exactly what I was going to say. It would be honorable, correct? You were a representative here at one time?
6 years.
I have a, Senator Woodburn, you have a question? No, please, Senator Woodburn.
Thank you, Chair, thank you. I first apologize for being late, coming down from the North Country. We certainly understand the issues that you're addressing in the town of Warren. And I know vaguely the issue of the Cape Farm, but I'm also very concerned about the rights of property rights and the person who, in this situation, as I understand it, and I don't know it well, this was a family that wanted this to occur. And how does that jive with property rights? I mean, the Catholic Church wanted to buy Warren and build something there. They don't have to pay property taxes. Obviously, it's not the same situation, but just help me understand this from the purview of property rights.
Okay. Thank you for the question, Senator. The current owner that's seeking to transfer title of that property is an out-of-state Massachusetts landowner with the best of intentions. No interest in the community. The Board of Selectmen has been down to his home in Massachusetts to ask him to reconsider because there are other mechanisms by which he can achieve his purposes. Philanthropic, to preserve the land and keep it free from development. White Mountain National Forest doesn't even want the piece of property. Force as a town to even present any kind of other than a supplication and to ask the landowner not to do it that way. So, yes, he has private property rights. When you read in the Constitution, both federal and state, when people come together in a society, they agreed to give up some of the freedoms that they have for the good of all. What's happening here is that the town is suffering. And the White Mountain National Forest will gain the best acreage in the town. For the best of reasons, they don't want it, but the landowner that wants to get it is doing so and causing harm to every other resident in the town. And that's where I think the crux is. There has to be some sort of potential for the community itself to speak, because that person's singular decision doesn't even have a vested interest in our town. He lives in Massachusetts. He doesn't pay property taxes. He doesn't have people on the fire department. None of that. So the rest of us bear the burden. So again, property rights are important, and so is the welfare of the community as a whole. If this process continues, you can see a situation arising where the communities are ultimately going to cease to exist. If you take this to the extreme, go 200 years down the road, and maybe that was their intention to begin with, but there are people, other people have property rights as well. And those rights, when you raise their taxes to the point they can't pay them anymore, their rights are being violated by these continuous singular donations or acquisitions.
Thank you. That was the question I was going to ask. So, thank you very much.
Thank you.
The chair will call Brad Simpkins.
Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the committee. For the record, my name is Brad Simpkins. I serve as the Director of the Division of Forests and Lands within the Department of Resources and Economic Development. I do have two handouts. I have written testimony. I also have the report that the Honorable Mrs. Cartwright already turned in, but I had it there, so I'm turning it in also. I'm not going to go through the testimony word for word. I just wanted to try to answer some questions. And DRED is coming at this from the standpoint we do not support this bill as written. With that said, we understand there are concerns and we appreciate it. But again, as the Honorable Cartwright did a very good job of going through RSA Chapter 121, there already is quite a process involved, and the issue, and I was at the hearings for 1147 and 1291 on the House, the issue is that the current process involved is not being followed, it appears, and so adding additional processes when the current law is not being followed, I don't think is really going to help matters. It's just going to create extra issues. So, you know, DRED is committed to working with the legislature to try to resolve this issue. A couple comments I would make is the U.S. Forest Service does follow the process laid out in Chapter 121. When they are purchasing land outside the proclamation boundary, they do come to DRED. The Land Use Board, that's another issue with the bill. This abolishes the Land Use Board. The Land Use Board was already abolished in the 1960s under RSA 12A7, so it doesn't exist in ways. The Planning and Development Commission was abolished under 12A7, and the Land Use Board is made up of members of the Planning and Development Commission. So that's already been abolished, and all the duties were rolled into DRED back in the 1960s. When the U.S. Forest Service wants to purchase property outside the proclamation boundary, they do come to us to seek permission, and they also do go through governor and council, so that they do follow that process. The gentleman from Warren just mentioned about changing that process. That's a policy decision, but I just wanted to make you aware that what stands in law right now is being followed by the U.S. Forest Service. The issue that you've heard a lot about this morning is really surrounding purchases by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Since the hearings in the House, we did do this report. This is based on the latest information in the statewide database that we have, primarily through the Granite GIS databases. On the back side of that, we selected certain towns, not every town, just because of time. But what we did is we looked at a map to see which towns had the largest area-wise Fish and Wildlife Service property. And so we did the valuation, but that's based on today's values, not the values of when they were purchased, which the law actually says when the land was purchased. The problem is, DRED does not, we don't know when these lands are being purchased. We find out when everybody else does. As I mentioned, the U.S. Forest Service notifies us before, but with Department of Interior lands, we don't know that. So that's part of the issue, is we can't do an analysis of 5% or anything until after the fact, after the land's been purchased. the last thing I'll say, and then I'll answer questions, so I want to keep this short, is since we've had the hearings in the House, we have reached out to Fish and Game. We have started conversations with them. They have already reached out to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I have spoken with the Attorney General's office. They are looking into this. One of the big questions that came up was, well, what authority does state law have on the federal government? And one of the primary ways that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service purchases land is through the Migratory Bird Conservation Act. They have several different funding sources, but that's a relatively large one. Under federal law, under that act, it requires, there's two separate sections of law, and one requires approval of the governor or the designated state agency, and the other one says that they need to have the permission through state law to do that. So when you look at that law, the federal law refers that you need to follow state law. And so that's for one source of funding. I don't know about LWCF and some of the other ones, but we're in the process of researching that. So I'll just wrap it up by saying we don't think this is really going to fix the issues you've heard about, because there's already a process that's not being followed. But DRED would be happy to work with whoever to try to resolve this issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony. We have some questions. Senator Reagan.
So your department and you are ready to work on amending this to come up with something that will protect the property rights of these landowners in the end. That's the...
Yes, we'd certainly be willing. And one of the things we talked about in the House committee is they asked about if we could do this report like annually, and if that's something that the legislature wanted, we don't have any issue developing this report so we can keep track of the 2% and those types of things. The 5% is the trick, though, because unless there's a mechanism for us to know beforehand, it'll always be after the fact.
Okay, thank you. Senator Cataldo.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The first question was answered appropriately that Senator Reagan asked. My second question is, as a Senate member of DRED, why haven't I been notified about this?
I'm not sure I understand.
I am a Senate member of DRED. I sit on that committee. Why haven't I been notified at all?
I'm not sure which committee you're referring to.
DRED. D-R-E-D. DRED.
The
I am on that committee as a state senator.
Well, we have many different committees within DRED. Which committee, DRED is the state agency, so which committee within DRED?
We'll sit down and talk after. Okay?
Sure,
Madam
yeah,
Chair.
absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Susie. And then Senator Woodward.
I just want to be clear about your testimony on regarding 2021.
Yes.
It is only with respect to the board responsibilities that there is a problem. Other responsibilities within the statute are completely taken over by DRED, or have been completely taken over by DRED.
Well, no, under RSA 12A7, the Planning and Development Commission was abolished and rolled into DRED. I believe that was in the early 1960s. So the Land Use Board was made up of members of the Planning and Development Commission. So therefore, since the Planning and Development Commission was abolished, the Land Use Board was basically abolished. So those duties that it talks about that the Land Use Board does would be DRED responsibilities, but not everything in RSA 121 has to do with the Land Use Board, if that answers your question.
It does. Thank you.
Senator Woodward.
Thank you. As I represent the northern part of the state, 27% of the state's land mass, there's an awful lot of land there, and an awful lot of conservation land and protected land. And I just want to first note that of all the meetings and people I've talked to, I've never heard any complaints about your department and the job that you're doing and your people are doing, first of all, that's number one. So the concerns that I've heard have been on the federal level. And I think that's a testament to your department and what you're doing, so thank you for that. My second question is, and you don't have to respond to that unless you want to. The second question is really where I have heard some complaints is around the fish and game piece. And I don't really understand the relationship between fish and game lands and your office. And I think that's an important piece. And if I can just elaborate with one example, when the windmills were built in Dixville, there was interveners that came in and opposed it, conservation folks, and they were rewarded at the end of the day. They got mitigation money. which then was used, and correct me, I think it was Greeno Pond in Errol, where some of that money was gone, if not all of it. And then it was what was private land, which was open to the public, became gated. And it's these types of actions that really infuriate people where, in the outside of the North Country, or outside of these areas where there's excess land, protecting land, you have the perception that it is more open, not more closed. So if you could just help me with that situation, and maybe my committee who understands this frustration in the North Country where conservation actually has closed land, not open it.
So, as far as the specific example you're talking about fishing game and gated land, I'm not aware of that specific example, but I'd be happy to follow up with you because we can certainly find out. We have a very good relationship with Fish and Game. They actually pay for a portion of the salaries of 2 of our foresters, and we manage the upland portions of the wildlife management areas. Also, whenever we're developing a timber sale or doing anything on red lands, Fish and Game, one of their biologists is on our state lands management team, so they can provide feedback with whatever we're planning to do. So we work very closely between the 2 agencies. In regards to conservation, DRED, and this is another issue that gets into the federal land acquisition. DRED holds about 250,000 acres of conservation easement land in the state. And the primary means of that is through the Forest Legacy Program, which is a federal program. The money comes from us through the Forest Service, but above that it comes through the Land and Water Conservation Fund, LWCF. It's a different part of LWCF than what the Fish and Wildlife Service uses, but it's a portion part of that specifically to the state. But even though it's federal money, the state holds that easement, not the federal government. So the landowners are working with the state. One of the things New Hampshire requires that is not a federal requirement is we require anytime we use public dollars to purchase conservation land, that land has to be open and accessible to the public. We don't feel it's appropriate to be putting taxpayer dollars into the land and then shutting it down. Other states do that. They'll buy private land that's posted, or you have to pay a fee to get on, those types of things. So the bulk of our conservation lands that we have, that we've purchased with that Forest Legacy, they're all open. So I'm not exactly sure of the gated issue that you speak of. I'd have to find out a little bit more about that. I don't know if that's an issue where they close down a road for mud season or something like that. I'd have to look into that.
Just one
Yes,
quick
follow-up.
follow-up question. Thank you for the answer to the question. But is all of the state's land, whether it be conservation land, whether it be Fish and Game or DRED, are they all under your purview?
No, DRED lands are under our purview, and then, if it's recreation-based, Parks and Rec manages that. We manage all the natural resources on DRED lands. Fish and Game oversees their lands, but we help manage their lands whenever there's forestry involved, since we have the forest. But the wildlife management areas fall under Fish and Game's purview, not ours.
Just one, sorry.
Yep, follow-up.
So different policies, different ways of managing it, different leadership channels, whether it be Fish and Game or DRED. And are there any other state, the pockets that we have, that they're all coordinated? I know we're getting a little bit off here, but how we manage our lands is important to the impact on the communities where it happens to sit. Is that the case, and are there any other entities of state government that would own this type of land?
As far as conservation land, DRED and Fish and Game would be the largest there are. And I do have Bill Carpenter with me, who's the administrator of our Land Management Bureau, so he may be able to answer that in a little bit more detail. There are some agencies, DOT owns some land, not just along highways, but, some where they purchased it for some reason in the past. I think Department of Environmental Services, I believe, owns some land. So there are some agencies, but much smaller than what DRED and Fish and Game. And we do all work together. We have a cooperative lands advisory committee that works together. So we try to, instead of having all these, everyone doing their own thing, we just talk a lot to cooperate for management of state lands.
Okay. Are there any further questions? Seeing none, thank you very much, Your
Thank
time
you.
is fine. The chair will call the last speaker, Jason Stock. Good morning, Mr. Stock.
For the record, my name is Jason Stock. I'm with the New Hampshire Timber Landowners Association. And I appreciate the opportunity to testify on Senate Bill 324. I signed in opposition to the bill as it was drafted. I think you've heard from Brad. There are, and a couple of the other speakers, there are some mechanical issues, but to Senator Reagan, I would be more than happy to work on this issue, should a subcommittee be assigned to it. This, as you've heard in prior testimony, this issue, what the impetus for this comes from a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service acquisition plan, the Silvio Conti's acquisition plan in the Connecticut River Valley. As an organization that represents the forest products industry as well as private landowners, we've looked at this issue in a number of different lights. And I guess when we looked at this issue, and then we looked at Senate Bill 324 in the context of it, I wanted to raise just a couple points that I'd like to leave with you for you folks to consider. As a landowner organization, eminent domain is the third rail. You just don't touch it. You don't go there, you don't touch it. To the extent that you can, obviously we realize there may be utility or highway projects, but when it comes to conservation land and wildlife refuges, eminent domain needs to be completely off the table. If you want the land, get it the old-fashioned way and offer. As you heard earlier, that Silvio Conti and the Wildlife Refuge, at the public hearings, when I pressed them on that question, well, we can't take it off the table, we don't like to use it, we can't take it off the table. Of course, for our members, that's not a satisfactory answer. But the other piece of this, and is when we look at it from a landowner's perspective, you've got the eminent domain piece, but you also have a landowner's right when it comes to willing buyer, willing seller that we look at as well. And so in this respect, you could say, geez, NHTO is a little schizophrenic on this issue. You don't like the feds buying land, but also you have landowners out there that may be willing to sell to the feds, and they may have money to buy it. How do you reconcile that? And the way we reconcile that is we look at, follow the money. If there's federal dollars involved in an acquisition, if there are dollars that are raised through taxes, there are a couple central tenets that we believe need to remain in place. One, there needs to be a public involvement process. As you've heard, the White Mountain National Forest, the U.S. Forest Service has done, they follow the rules. They do a good job. Some would argue they go ad nauseum with some of their public hearings and outreach, but I'd rather have it that way than what we've seen with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, where even before the public hearings began, they were doing real estate deals. The week before the first public hearing up in St. Johnsbury, I'm getting photos from people's cell phones showing me where the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is putting up signs on parcels that they were seeking to acquire an interest in that were going to be the subject of next week's public hearing. And so that enraged us. The other part is, and this speaks to Senator Woodburn's, some of those signs said access by authorized personnel only, which to us means it's posted. And again, look at it in the context of where did the dollars come from, what's the purpose here. Those were problems that we had with that deal. I've got a fact sheet that we put together on it to give you the background. But the other piece of this is we're looking at changing the state policy and making some significant changes to it. This will affect all
we're looking at a Senate Bill 324 in the context of Silvio Conti. There are federal acquisitions that do work, and that work, and that Senate Bill 324 could potentially create some problems. Conservation easements, Forest Legacy Program, you heard about that earlier, the successful land conservation program. That's a program, keeps the land in private ownership, but it also keeps it on the tax rolls. When we read Senate Bill 324, the question that comes to our mind is, it is a federal interest that's being purchased. Granted, they're not buying the total fee ownership, but how would this apply to, say, a conservation project where there's federal dollars involved in it? That was a concern that our legislative affairs committee raised. Also, there may be real estate swaps or real estate transactions outside of conservation projects, say a brownfield development project or something of that nature, where you need to have some kind of federal backing or federal ownership as part of that deal. Does this, the question that came to mind is, would this statute or this bill impact that? So having said that, I guess, and for the sake of trying to keep the morning moving along here, we'd be happy to work on any subcommittee that looks at this. As you'll see, the Silvio Conti is mismanaged, I would say, and it's not a good deal for the state. But Senate Bill 324, I don't think will solve that problem. And I think it may create some other problems that we should consider as we move forward. So, having said that, I will be happy to try and answer any questions.
Thank you very much for your testimony this morning, Mr. Stock. Are there any questions from the committee? Senator Cataldo.
Just two, Madam Chair, thank you. Did the federal government override eminent domain in New Hampshire?
Did the federal government override eminent domain? Not being an attorney, a real estate attorney, I'm not certain. What I've been told and what I understand is that there is they can justify it. There's a kind of a pecking order, if you will, and a precedence that they can take.
Just a follow-up on that, Madam Chair.
Follow up?
In other words, if we have eminent domain law in New Hampshire, the federal government could override it?
Again, as a non-lawyer, I understand it is yes. And this is part of the raging debate that occurs when you look at FERC and power line projects and gas line projects, because the question comes, we can pass eminent domain bills, but and that's part of the challenge with this, is, as you heard, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is not following the state process. I have to believe if they were, we probably wouldn't be here this morning talking about this, but they didn't. And they've created this problem, and how do you bring them to the table? It's interesting that they're not here testifying on any of this or weighing in, and it's a tremendous frustration for, as you heard, the landowners, but also as businesses that rely on those lands for logs, pulpwood, and recreation.
Last question, Madam Chair.
Follow up?
Who is or who are Silvio Conti?
Silvio Conti is, that's the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And they are, that is the entity that oversees the Silvio Conti Wildlife Refuge. It's a unique refuge because, as you saw on the maps, they have an area kind of designated. Within that area, they have specific refuges where they purchase land. Pondicherry up in Jefferson is owned by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. It's part of this bigger kind of this Connecticut River project. And so what their proposal is, they have this area designated as kind of a target area. We've heard from landowners today that are concerned. They have this target area, and they're saying, all right, we want to acquire more land in the Mascoma area, the Ashwellet River area, Vermont, Connecticut, and Mass. So, long answer to your short question, it's the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, but you have specific refuges within this kind of designated area.
So one more follow-up on the same question. Madam
Follow
Chair.
up, Senator.
If you haven't answered the question, who is or who are Sylvia Conti? Where did the name come from?
Oh. I can answer that, yeah.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, I didn't,
Thank you
Okay,
very much,
that's what it
Mr.
was.
Sykes.
Thanks.
We're gonna go ahead and close the
Okay.
public hearing on
Western
Senate Bill
Mass.
324.